Good afternoon, or morning or evening, depending on where you're dialing in from. My name is Tasneem Azad. I am a managing director here at Kroll and head of our firm's EMEA economics disputes team. I'd like to extend an extremely warm welcome to everyone joining this webinar today on navigating the elevated risk environment in a COVID world. This is a topic in my mind with particular resonance for the pharmaceutical and medical devices industry, and I'm absolutely delighted to be joined today by a rather impressive panel of speakers. We have here today Roeland van Aelst. Roeland is the EMEA lead of third-party intermediary ethics and compliance at Johnson & Johnson. I should just point out at this stage that Roeland joins us today in a personal capacity, and so his remarks are not to be taken as the official position of Johnson & Johnson. Roeland, great to have you here with us today. Next, we have John Ingrassia. John is senior counsel at the leading global law firm Proskauer Rose. John, delighted to have you join us.
Thank you, Tasneem.
And then finally, we have my colleague, Dan Hartnett. Dan is currently Chief of Staff of Kroll's Governance, Risk, Investigations and Disputes team. Although pertinent to today's conversation, up until recently, Dan led the firm's supply chain risk management team. Dan, great to have you here as well today. Now, I'll leave Roeland, John, Dan, and to tell you a bit more about themselves when they speak and join the discussion. But in general terms, I think what we're hoping to achieve today is to share with you a deep industry perspective from Roeland, an understanding of the complex legal landscape via John, a view of the issues through a political lens via Dan, and finally, through myself, my thoughts on assessing risks and on working towards compliance. Together, I hope that by the end of this panel discussion, we will have left you with a comprehensive overview of the challenges facing global supply chains today, and we will have shared with you some pointers on how to go about navigating those challenges. Before we dive in, if you could just allow me a couple of minutes to tell you, or a minute even, just to tell you about the structure of the session today, just so you know what to expect. We will start the session with an overview of the issues from each of our individual perspectives. We will start with Roeland, John, Dan, and then myself. We then hope to delve into a few of the core themes that come up, and we will cover that as a discussion, as a group discussion in the panel. Dan will kindly be moderating that session for us and that discussion for us. Finally, and of course most importantly, what we intend to do is to leave sufficient time at the end for us to address your questions. So you'll note on the platform that there's an option to submit some questions. Please do ask as many questions as you like. We will do our utmost to address them. And with that, I think that's plenty by way of introduction. So without further ado, please let me pass the baton on to Roeland. Roeland, over to you.
Thank you, Tasneem, and good morning, afternoon, or evening, everybody. So as Tasneem mentioned, I work for Johnson & Johnson. I've been doing that for the past 34 years and 18 years in sales and marketing, national and international. And about 16 years ago, I moved to what we call healthcare compliance. So focusing on ethical interaction between industry and our customers and stakeholders and government officials. And in the last 2 years, actually, I've been focusing on, anti-corruption program with regard to our sales intermediaries primarily, but also any kind of intermediary in our supply chain that interacts with our customer or with the government officials. So all built around the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And in that capacity, I will focus on how the COVID crisis has impacted, that part of our business. Also interesting to mention, I think that I am the chairman of the MedTech Europe Code Committee, and I also am president of a thing organization of compliance officers called ethics, which is an international association of professionals. Now with that, let's dive into the topic of today's risk perspective with regard to third-party intermediaries and that piece of our supply chain and how it was impacted by the COVID crisis. Because I think you cannot look at risk today without bearing in mind the impact that the crisis has had today. First, if I look at the COVID-19 crisis, so what we did see in the heat of the crisis was one, certainly for instance in our medical devices space, some parts of our business went from 100 to 0 in about two weeks' time. So where normal supply would roll, all of a sudden a lot of that stopped overnight, which of course has an impact on how you deal with your suppliers. What we've seen is basically, because on the flip side, there was also business that doubled and tripled. There were products that all of a sudden were in extremely high demand. The crisis is that, this brings out the best and the worst in mankind. So while we've seen on one hand that where there was a high need, some companies started giving equipment away, right, which might be a nice thing to do, but from a legal point of view, where you have competition law and so forth, that's not necessarily the most obvious thing to do. On the other hand, what we've seen is where some people normally let the game of supply and demand play. When you do that in a crisis, certainly in a human crisis situation of this magnitude, and all of a sudden you start to abuse your power position because you have in stock what everybody wants, and you then increase your prices, it's up to tenfold. That creates issues, and of course, for an organization like ours, where we have products on both ends of this equation, a lot of concern, and we needed to pay a lot of attention, certainly to our intermediaries that might have had those products in stock that were in high demand, so that we do not end up in price gouging situations. On the other hand of the equation, we had to look at what do we do with demands for free product, or and we looked at it with the trade association. So there it helped, of course, that we could look at it with the MedTech Europe code and say, well, normally the code does not allow to give products for free, but under these circumstances, we were able to create specific guidance to companies on how do you manage these demands, because there was a clear need, and we had to create a kind of safe harbor for organizations to be able to donate, or to donate for a certain period of time, or to make loan arrangements free of charge for a limited period of time. So we had to create some guidelines also about how long is this crisis now really lasting, and in fact we have not found the answer to that yet, because we don't know when the end is coming. Another element that we definitely needed to look at more from an internal point of view is normally when we follow up on pricing of products and how deals are put together, typically you would have volume-based pricing, or you may have rebates that have both volume and time milestones. In several of our products, and particularly in the medical device space, all of a sudden demand dropped to zero, or use dropped to zero. And then, of course, you have to look and work with your intermediaries in order to, how does that impact the deal we had made? And some deals, of course, it's relatively easy to go back and adjust. But if that's part of tender business, if you actually have deals with the authorities and all of a sudden the demand stops and also the payment stops, then it's really important that you work and talk to your intermediaries and try to find solutions that are that allow them to survive, and at the same time they do not break any laws, right? Because there is competition law that sneaks around the corner and that may not give you the liberty what you would typically want to do. So these were part of some of the key challenges that we were really facing in the heat of the crisis, and that gave us a lot of headache. But at the same time, we've learned a lot in this crisis as well, and we believe we came out stronger. That was my introduction on this space. If anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Tasneem.
Many thanks, Roeland. And just turning over to John from a legal perspective. Thank you, John.
Thanks, Tasneem, and thanks, Roeland. Roeland did raise the issue of price gouging and price gouging compliance and how to deal with that. And I do want to expand on that when we're talking about the sort of the legal issues, specifically the elevated legal issues in terms of managing compliance in time of COVID. My background is largely as an antitrust lawyer in the M&A context and in the counseling context across life sciences and also a range of industries. We have been focusing very strongly in the past year or so on compliance, specifically around pricing controls or price gouging laws. It's an area that is very closely related to antitrust in that they're both consumer welfare regimes, if you will. And so I do want to take a few minutes to expand on some of what Roeland raised with respect to price gouging and why it's relevant here in general and specifically with respect to life sciences. Price gouging laws generally are pricing restrictions, so they're not the normal course of the market economy. They are rules that sort of displace the market economy and limit the ability of supply and demand forces to dictate price, which is the sort of the natural way pricing is set. We have them because in certain scenarios where there's an emergency, a local disaster, a natural disaster, where there's a scarcity and the market is sort of not functioning in the traditional way or in the way it should, the government steps in. The local government, typically it might be a state government, will step in and impose pricing restrictions and activate, if you will, their price gouging statute, which may be on the books but not activated. It will be activated by the announcement of a state of emergency in that time of scarcity with respect to a particular product, and put pricing controls in place with respect to that product or the range of products that need protection because the market is not functioning in that scenario. Historically, these are rules that exist only for a short period of time and on a fairly local basis, again, in response to maybe a natural disaster, a hurricane, a tornado, earthquake, mudslides. There's lots of reasons these get activated, wildfires, and they do from time to time. But the history has been that they're local and that they're short-lived, and it may be in place for a week, or several weeks, or maybe a month or so until things sort of come back and the market regains its ability to function normally in that area. What's different here, vastly different, is the scope and the duration of what we've seen in terms of these states of emergency, because on an unprecedented basis, we had a national state of emergency plus 50 individual states of emergency activated at the same time. They came online, all within a very short period of each other in March of 2020, and that activated all of the pricing restrictions, all of the price gouging laws that were on the books, plus others where either attorneys general or governors by executive order imposed pricing restrictions in those states that didn't have formal legislation already on the books. And so that was a remarkable and, again, unprecedented difference in terms of the way business had to react to that. It covered a broad range of products, and not just the personal protective equipment, but all across the industries from building, food and housing, and of course medical supplies and pharmaceutical. 18 U.S. states, it's worth noting, specifically identify in their price gouging statutes medicine or medical products or some sort of pharma-related business. And so those are specifically mentioned. For the ones that don't, some are more narrow and some are more broad. And so arguably it's covered by more than 18 states, but probably at least half of the states at least have some restriction in place. And even currently, because these states of emergency haven't all been lifted yet, and in fact, very few have been lifted. And that includes states like, New York, Texas, California, the big economies, of this country. And so it's a significant issue. And when you're trying to comply on a national basis, it means that you have to think about sort of what the restrictions are in those most important economies, and what the state scope of the restrictions are, and then sort of use that as your baseline, if you will, in terms of how you operate on a national basis. And so it does implicate life sciences, pharma in a significant way. We've seen lots of enforcement by, again, state attorneys general, lots of complaints and lots of enforcement and lots of investigations, and we've assisted clients with respect to those, both in terms of informal investigations and formal investigations. And so there's been a lot of activity in the area. We're trying to counsel on compliance, and that means with respect to distributors, manufacturers, companies, businesses operating on a national basis, managing how to comply with respect to day-to-day business practices. Again, these are not bad actors. These are companies operating in the normal course of business, where suddenly their normal course of business may potentially violate an emergency order. So managing that compliance has been very important for a lot of folks, and we've been able to assist with that for a lot of our clients. In addition to that, and the reason we've been counseling on this is that there's risk not just from state attorneys general, where you do have some level of prosecutorial discretion, and they may not go after folks who aren't a bad actor, if you will, who made an innocent mistake. But with respect to private third-party claims, again, a number of states do permit private enforcement with respect to price gouging statute, and there you don't have the filter. There you have class action plaintiffs looking for foot faults, if you will, in terms of compliance, missteps, and looking to bring a claim. And on top of that, what we have, where you wouldn't have seen that normally in the case of maybe a local state of emergency for a tornado in an area that's small and where the duration might be a couple of weeks at most. When you're talking about a nationwide scope and scope of now 15 months and counting, there's a lot of damages that can pile up in terms of failure to comply. And so that's why the plaintiffs' firms are out there. That's why we're seeing these class actions get filed, and that's really what the landscape looks like right now. So, so what we want to talk about today, with that in mind, are how do we comply? What are the best practices? And I know Tasneem will touch on that some, and others, but certainly tracking and monitoring, knowing the rules, and making sure that you're staying within the scope of what you can do for as long as the states of emergency remain in effect, and for the most part they still do. That would really be the touch point I would highlight. So with that, I'll pass it back to Tasneem.
Great, many thanks, Don, much appreciated. Dan, over to you for the regulatory and political viewpoint. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Tasneem, and thanks to all our other panelists today and to our audience for attending. So I'm, as I mentioned, going to talk about the political aspects. Just give a quick little background. So I am, as I mentioned, Chief of Staff for one of our business units here at Kroll, but really the focus for me the past few years has been focusing on supply chain risk management, and we really focus across the firm on those kind of disruptive risks, right? So not necessarily just pure inventory issues, but rather more along the lines of anything from adverse actors in your third party to cyber attacks against you or your partners up and down the supply chain. So those type of risks. but also includes political risk, things that might set your supply chain into turmoil. And that's why I'm going to focus on today for the most part. So the particular risk I'm talking about here is both a risk and an opportunity, as are many risks, but it's really the administration, the Biden administration's executive order on U.S. supply chains, otherwise known as Executive Order 14017. Now, this executive order was pretty wide and broad encompassing, and we're going to focus on the pharmaceutical perspective for this, but it touches upon many different industry sectors. Now, the executive order was released in February of this year, late February, it was February 24th. And its stated objective was to assess vulnerabilities in key U.S. supply chains and identify potential actions to be taken. So really, it's really a review and assessment phase at this point in time. Although there's already been some actions released from that I'll speak about in a minute or two. So there's two main components to this executive order, and as I mentioned, it's pretty broad and encompassing. The first is a 100-day review that was a kickoff near immediately after the executive order was released in February, and it looked at 4 key supply chains or supply chain sectors, if you will. And those were semiconductor manufacturing, advanced packaging, large capacity batteries, critical materials and minerals, and most important for this conversation, pharmaceuticals and APIs, which was actually being led by HHS, and really the FDA was the one that was kind of leading the charge on that review. Now, the second component is more of a longer-term, one-year assessment or analysis of 6 other industry sectors. I won't mention those here, but the most important one for this conversation, again, is for the HHS was, again, to lead a review of, quote, supply chains for the public health and biological preparedness industrial base, end quote. Not necessarily what we call a word that rolls right off the tongue there, but again, pharmaceutical supply chain, industrial base, APIs, that's what they're talking about there. So look forward to that one coming out. But we'll focus more on that 100-day review, which was just released recently. So each of the reviews was to be quite thorough, actually, in what they asked for. And so they start off with asking for an assessment of the current state of the supply chain for that industry sector, what are the current threats out there and the assessments of them, the resilience of the supply chain in front of those threats, right? How resilient were they, or lack of resiliency as the case may be, and what gaps needed to be addressed, right? And then finally, potential allies and partnerships. Now, the key to all of these is that there would be recommendations for any type of executive, legislative, regulatory, or policy changes that would be coming out there. Not to say that all of those would be enacted, of course. That would probably be it's not feasible in any administration. But then many of them would have actions that could be picked up by some member or branch of the government going forward. Now, it's key to point out here that this executive order, while big in the news, and it was very kind of front and center for a while there, as long as many topics deal with supply chain risk, it's worth noting that it wasn't the first effort by a U.S. administration to look in or tackle supply chain risk, particularly U.S. critical supply chains. The Trump administration actually had an executive order as well in its early days. And there's been other aspects as well, actions that were below an executive order, maybe just at a different departmental level. And of course, so is U.S. Congress, which almost yearly comes out with some type of supply chain risk management focused either bill or rider on some other bill. And so there's been actions, again, across the U.S. government at various levels, as well as state level actions, indeed. Now, the pharmaceutical focus here of this most recent executive order really complements an order about actually about almost a month prior from the Biden administration. One of its first executive orders, actually, which specifically looked at PPE, right, and production of it in an effort to help combat COVID-19 pandemic. But this one's more broad than the recent one. It is definitely broader in focus and depth. So just recently, on June 8th, the actual report was released, right? So this is the review and assessment period, and the report actually came out. And if you haven't read it yet, I can spare you some of the pain. It's a very long report. It weighs in at 250 pages. It's extremely comprehensive. To be fair, it covers all 4 of those sectors that I mentioned, so it's not just focused on the pharmaceutical sector. But the pharmaceutical sector does get roughly 50 pages or so devoted to it, so there's definitely some meat behind that there. There are some immediate impacts, or at least areas for action, and they center around 5 basic pillars, and that's the way I would sparse it out. So first is to boost local production and fostering international cooperation with allies. The key there is international cooperation with allies, right? There was a concerted concern the past year that there was over-reliance upon China, a little bit less so on India, but particularly on China for APIs, for example, and PPEs. And so you're seeing that come out in the executive order and the findings. The second area focuses on promoting research and development to strengthen supply chain resilience, which is never actually a bad thing. That could apply to many industry sectors, not just the pharmaceutical industry. The third pillar is the improved quality management for drug manufacturing and quality performance. Again, another good area to focus on for whatever actions they enact there. And then fourth is increasing the use of data to improve supply chain resilience. So my colleagues and I, as we looked at and helped out clients over the past year, one thing we've seen over and over again is that those supply chains and those companies who came out in the back end of the pandemic in a better state, or very least in the less impacted states, were those that had, good use of data, good transparency across the end-to-end supply chain. So more of that will then increase resiliency going forward, regardless of what type of disruption occurs. And the final pillar is the expanding and improving emergency capacities of key pharmaceuticals and APIs, such as the use of strategic stockpiles. Which is something that's actually worth looking into on a different time, because there's actually a lot there that could actually have a very big impact on global supply chains. So in closing, I want to use my time to make sure that Tasneem and my other colleagues have more time to discuss. It's really critical to note that this executive order, very broad, very encompassing, and very thorough in its findings and assessment at the end, still is in those early stages, right? The recommendations need to be enacted. The devil's in the details, as we say. How will these be enacted? Which ones will be enacted? It's not clear that all of them will be enacted, of course. And will there be additional activities on the back end? Most likely, is my opinion. Really coherent effort by Congress will come out of that. It's Congress, and a former Hill staffer, I can tell you Congress is currently in the midst of drafting their bills right now for the end of the cycle at the fall time frame. So we expect to see more in the coming months as they pick up some of these recommendations and look to put them into law potentially. So more to come on this one, but it looks like that in general, the executive order and its findings, again, very thorough, very comprehensive, and the potential to have a large long-term impact on the pharmaceutical supply chains. So with that, I'll yield my time and turn it back over to Tasneem.
Dan, thank you very much. Now, Roeland, John, and Dan have painted quite a vivid picture here of how varied and, how potentially material some of these rules and policy changes are. I think that takes us neatly on to what I wanted to focus on, which is how might a multinational go about complying with these rules? John made a valid point in referring to, these not being bad actors. The vast majority of firms really do have good intentions. They're not looking to deliberately breach rules or take advantage of their suppliers or try and exploit vulnerable customers. And they're certainly not looking to do that at the time of a crisis. But there is still a compliance challenge for these firms. No matter how efficient and well-run they may be, they might just find themselves running afoul of these rules despite their best efforts. And the reason for that is, in picking up on some of the points that Roeland has made, these supply chains today are really quite complex. They're multifaceted, they have numerous layers to them. If not global, they're at least regional. There's an intricate web of relationships amongst suppliers and the different teams responsible for planning, sourcing, production, distribution, and ultimately retail. And then the challenge just gets multiplied further once you start looking at a portfolio of products rather than a single product. And again, once you add in services into the mix. So, and the further issue that compounds this is that, the more complicated these supply chains become, decision-making is very likely to be decentralized. So in other words, decisions may not be managed by HQ somewhere, but they might be managed by teams locally, dealing with local operational and practical challenges, dealing with local demand and supply conditions, and they may be responding to those hour by hour or minute by minute. And all of that makes this compliance challenge really quite non-trivial. Because first you need to stay abreast of these changing rules that are changing by the minute. As we've heard from John, they vary by jurisdiction. John touched on the US, but there are global restrictions as well. All over the world, similar rules are being considered. And then second, there's the challenge of adjusting your internal system to respond to these changes. And that might be easier said than done. If your systems are automated and difficult to update, you might have to retrain large bodies of staff. You might have to put in established processes for monitoring and collecting data and reporting. So what's a firm to do in this situation? I think, in my view, a very good first step is to actually start with a risk assessment. Try to ask a series of questions to ascertain how likely it is that these rules are going to bite and how material they might be if they do. So just as a simple example, you might want to start with half a dozen questions. How many of the products within the firm's portfolio are likely to be caught? How substantial a part of the business are they? Where in the supply chain are the concerns arising? How are local conditions managed within the supply chain? How well trained are your core teams in compliance processes? And, what are their current awareness levels of regulations? And then finally, what sort of monitoring and reporting systems are in place? Once you start collecting answers to these types of questions, you can gauge very quickly where the risks are, and you can start piecing together some sort of understanding of where to focus attention, and start pulling together the bones of a coherent, short-term and long-term compliance solution. One of the critical questions, and I've touched on this earlier, is around the availability of data. I think data is crucial. It's crucial currency for effective compliance. Having systems in place to collect the right data, analyze it as rapidly as possible in real time if need be, and to share it with the right teams is crucial to ensure compliance. And also touching on a point that John made around follow-on damages claims, critically, a record of all the information can help in the event that things do subsequently go wrong and there is a risk of litigation. And having those records could help mitigate the damages. So what then in terms of compliance solutions? We're going to go on and talk about those in a little bit more detail and come up and discuss some practical examples soon. But I think in general terms, every solution is going to be unique. It's going to be very specific to the firm involved. In short, every solution will be bespoke. Much depends on, the portfolio of products, the geographic footprint, who the third parties are and the suppliers that are involved, how effective are, existing policies and systems. All of those things will need to be taken into consideration to come up with an effective short-term and long-term compliance program. But we will touch on some examples as part of the rest of this discussion. With that, I think now might be the time to dive into some of these issues in more detail. And I'd like to hand over to Dan to help moderate that. Thank you, Dan.
No problem. Happy to moderate here. And just to remind you for all our panelists, because we're running up on time, make sure we have enough time for everyone to talk and get questions from the audience. Try and keep your responses, somewhat short to maybe 2 or 3 minutes per. So I've taken the liberty to go ahead and kind of formulate a few kind of front-loaded questions here for one for each of our panelists. So I'll start off here. First one for John, actually. When it comes to respect to pricing issues, what are the key issues that businesses need to stay ahead of as it relates to today's legal, regulatory, and business environment?
Thanks, Dan. That's a really important question. For the kind of compliance work that that we've been focused on. And pricing really has been front and center now. Again for a year plus 15 months and counting. There's a renewed interest in these price gouging laws. Both at the local level and at the federal level, as you've discussed as well. Both with respect to standalone legislation that's pending and under the Defense Production Act, which is our federal price gouging legislation. It's a little bit more limited in scope in terms of the products that are subject to it, but within life sciences, we're sort of squarely within scope. And so the Defense Production Act and the restrictions around pricing there are within scope and what we need to be thinking about in terms of compliance. On top of that, again, because of the renewed interest that we're seeing new legislation come online, not only at the federal level, but at the state level, fairly rapidly now. We're seeing states that did not have price gouging or formal price gouging legislation in place, put it in place. We're seeing revisions to existing legislation, enhanced rules, clarified rules. And so really it is an issue that requires attention and diligence in terms of monitoring compliance with respect to pricing. A lot of this is targeted directly at the life sciences industry and pharma and medical devices, and so again, it's really within scope. And so managing pricing, getting arms around, if you will, so what pricing looks like and how to stay within scope of compliance is really key. I'd say in terms of dealing with regulators, what we've seen in outreach from regulators are typically questions, and this goes to what Tasneem talked about in terms of making sure you have the data. Regulators will come knocking in response to a complaint and start asking for information and cost data and pricing data, and making sure that we have data available and readily available and accurate is key. But I'd also say that one thing is to another important piece is to understand what they're asking and why they're asking it and how that fits with the rule and how that fits with compliance, because this is an area that most regulators sort of don't play in on a regular basis. And so you may be dealing with regulators who don't fully understand the scope of the rules, the scope of the permissible pricing movements or increases, the scope of defenses. So understanding all of that makes you a better advocate in terms of responding to regulators and advocating for your client. And so all of that together, I'd say, is key, and then understanding, really, what the risk is and what the exposure is. Just to close it out in terms of, the business environment, in addition to compliance and potential fines and damages, it's reputational as well. And again, because we're talking here about, reputable firms that operate on a national and international basis that are managing compliance as best they can, and so it's reputational as well, and that's a key piece of it. And so we want to make sure that those kinds of compliance footfalls again don't become an issue. Just in terms of again regular course of business, and I'll close out with this. Again, it's not just about sort of where I set my prices. Am I within scope of the pricing restrictions that may be in place, but we're seeing scenarios where in a regular course of business, you may have an annual supply contract with, escalator provisions or annual escalator provisions that maybe affirmatively have to be put on hold to manage compliance. And so it's not only sort of overt acts, what you do in terms of compliance, but what happens even as a matter of course, and making sure that you're looking at things like that and, putting holds in place where you need to in terms of what would be normal pricing movements. So all of that, I think, is in play and needs to be thought about when we're talking about compliance.
Great, John. Thank you. Very comprehensive answer there. So I'm going to flip it a little bit, but look at a little longer term aspects. And Roeland, from your view or from the industry's view, if you can say that, What are some of the longer-term impacts to include potential new rules and statutes of the pandemic, especially as it relates, again, to pricing, which seems to be an essential topic we've been discussing on this panel here?
Well, I think there's a couple of things that we can look at, because we are finding ourselves as a healthcare industry, certainly those who are in the supply of vaccines, in a very particular situation. We have several companies today that actually sell at cost price, and everybody knows it. So it's kind of like not a public secret that some companies sell at cost price. Others make, let's say, a moderate profit on what they sell, which is completely not what it used to be in terms of, price negotiation and reimbursement and all of that. So none of that happened in the crisis. So all of a sudden there was an immediate need for the vaccines, and whatever deal could be made was made. And we've seen, price discussions by various nations on the various different circumstances and so forth. So there's nothing normal about that situation. And of course that one cannot last. The other interesting aspect, of course, is that we had co-funding. So some of the developments, but maybe not primarily the research, but certainly actually the increase of supply, right, was co-funded by authorities in the US, in Europe. So all of that has an impact on how actually companies are positioning their products for the future. So today, I think still many companies are wondering how they will, try to move that from a crisis situation into a kind of like sustained model. And that, I think a lot of discussions will still need to happen on how that will be shaped. Now, when it comes to, that's of course for the vaccines, and we'll see how that plays. What I think it comes to the other products in healthcare, in fact, I think the crisis primarily accelerated trends that were already ongoing, right? So we had already quite a lot of price pressure, certainly in countries where you have government-supported healthcare, and which I think in many countries in the world is the case. There's pressure on price, not necessarily to reduce the entire healthcare budget, but there was pressure on how can you demonstrate that your products are really worth what you claim that they are worth. So you're going to see much more evidence-based models, and actually pricing depending, or reimbursement depending on how well your products perform in real life. So while you may have an additional price agreement, you're going to see that the price may be impacted a posteriori, when your product has proven that it delivers what you promised. Another thing that we'll see, certainly then maybe more in the medical devices, is that the same time they want to see evidence that whatever you bring to the market works. So you're going to see outcome-based procurement, which means it's not just about your product, but it's how your product, and certainly in the medical devices, how the whole procedure that the patient goes through leads to a certain end result. So companies are going to focus not only delivering the product, but also working on other steps that accompany a product to its end stage. And you'll see more like total deals, products and services being offered together. And so that may lead to a less transparent price situation where your product has a price, the services has a price. It's going to be brought together. And at the end of the day, the payer may be looking at paying for the total and paying for the outcome rather than paying for the products individually. So those are the kind of things that were already starting before the crisis. But I think we are still to see the real impact from a financial point of view of this crisis, because today everything is additionally supported, but at some point that source will dry up. That will then, I think, lead to pressure on pricing. And then I think it will be interesting to see how these trends that were already starting, how they will accelerate, and how we will work with the different authorities on how our products and services will be bought moving forward.
Oh, great, Roland. Your comments made me think about a comment I heard from a well-known supply chain risk manager earlier, well, actually at the end of the past year, was saying COVID-19 was like gasoline on the fire, making a lot of these changes across the supply chains that were already taking place before, maybe not quite as fast or as in a hurried fashion as they are now because of the reasons you stated. So I'm going to take the prerogative for a minute to kind of broaden it out. So we've been talking about pricing a lot here. And so what are some of the other challenges for the life sciences and particularly the pharmaceutical supply chain, from a more broad brush perspective? Then we'll turn over to Tasneem and talk about, what is it that companies can do. So looking at it, from, again, a long-term post-pandemic world, what are some of the challenges out there for the life science supply chains? I would say, in short, it's really the increased exposure to risk due to large-scale disruptions, right? And it's going to be up and down the supply chain from a global perspective. And I'm not necessarily referring to, pandemic-like disruptions that we've seen for the past, 16 plus months and everything, but rather disruptions due to the reconfiguration of supply chains. Now, as you can remember, from supply chains, they're not really necessarily inherently flexible entities at the end of the day, right? They were created with the efforts to increase efficiency, effectiveness, and cost savings in mind, not necessarily resiliency or agility, right? That was kind of a tertiary, if not even beyond a thought, if at all. And so that's kind of the opposite of flexibility, right? They're kind of brittle, some of the terms you can use to describe them at certain times. And pharmaceutical supply chains, I would argue, are definitely a great example of this, where they are long-standing supply chains with long-standing relationships with their various vendors up and down, the end-to-end supply chain. And so they don't necessarily need to constantly swap in and out of new vendors. They may do that on a tactical level, but really from a strategic, cross end-to-end supply chain perspective, they're relatively fixed, right? And that's good for certain things. Again, cost effectiveness and cost savings. But when it comes to disruptions or churn, that then cause a lot of challenges because now you need to go out and reconfigure your supply chain. That's a very arduous task, as anybody who's worked in that industry can tell you. But as I mentioned earlier, the United States government is looking, in effect, to restructure or at least influence the structure of pharmaceutical supply chains, at least as they have touch points with the United States. I suppose, carrot and stick methods to do that. Now, it remains to be seen how effective those efforts will be, and I can't comment on that. But what I can say is that there's definitely a clear effort to do that. And I would say it's also not just the United States government, right? There are efforts within Europe to do similar, right? To kind of, strengthen their own particular supply chains and make sure that they're safe, and their citizens have the access to those pharmaceutical drugs that they need to have. And I would also argue that even companies themselves are kind of taking a proactive approach to maybe reconfiguring their supply chain footprint. I think they're still in the early stages of that, depending on which company we're talking about in particular. But they're looking for ways to improve resiliency, improve safety, minimize their exposure to geographic concentration, where you have not only your immediate first-tier suppliers, but maybe even your second, third, and fourth-tier suppliers are all in one location, right? So you have a hub of risk, in one geography that could be brought down for various reasons, as we saw during the height of the pandemic. But there's also a possibility of cost savings, which is, kind of interesting, that the fact that, supply chains were originally set up for cost savings, and now that companies may be thinking about looking at them again and see if they can identify other types of cost savings by reconfiguring the footprint. Now, a study by some of my Kroll colleagues last year, really showed that the pharmaceutical industry really wasn't yet at the point of being ripe for reshoring or nearshoring of manufacturing, at least not yet. Only if the U.S. government or its local state government stepped in to, provide some incentives. Well, go back to my executive order that I was talking about earlier, where you are now starting to see those incentives, be it the carrot or stick method potentially coming out. So maybe you might see a lot more reshoring or nearshoring of the U.S. supply chains across the globe. So what this all does, though, is it increases the risk exposure for a variety of reasons. But first and foremost, because you have a lot of potential new actors in your supply chain. And that in and of itself is a high risk issue, right? As soon as you onboard new suppliers or new vendors or new agents, whatever it may be within your supply chain, it just exposes you to more instances of potential fraud, bribery, corruption, cyber and data privacy concerns that maybe you weren't so worried about before because your vendors had already been cleared and you had done your risk assessments. You have physical security risks, right? From anything from the R&D side of the house all the way up through production, distribution, storage of the products. You have potential legal and contract risks that might be up there if you decide to break contracts or if your partners decide to break contracts and then they're on the hold for some kind of legal reasons. And then finally, obviously, you have the political risks out there, right, where it could be the constant changing of regulations or legislation, or the fact of just trying to extricate yourself from certain markets. So there's a lot of risks that go along with changing of supply chains, regardless of what industry sector we're in. And so my comment on, the kind of changes of a long-term nature there remains to be seen, what will happen from the U.S. executive order, but likely there will be some impacts in causing more churn than the industry has historically been used to. So I'll pause it there for my part and actually open up to Tasneem. We can start talking more about the idea of what can companies do, right? What are some of the operational steps that these companies can take to proactively implement in order to improve their resiliency from all these challenges and risks we've been talking about. So Tasneem, over to you, please.
Sure, thank you, Dan. From everything that we've been talking about so far, it does sound like it's an insurmountable gargantuan problem where operational solutions will be very difficult to put together, and where you need technology and you need an evolving organic compliance solution to track the supply chain and retrain new vendors and new suppliers, etc. I genuinely do think, though, that some of the simplest solutions can be the most powerful and the most effective. I'll share three examples that I have come across that work incredibly well, and they really are genuinely quite simple. One of the first ones is putting in place something like a compliance hotline. A direct channel of communication up to management or up to the central compliance team. And this is because it's generally staff at the front line who have the most visibility, direct visibility of local risks, potential problems. And in many cases, these local staff may simply not know who to contact and how. Providing them with something as simple as a hotline to the right team is, maybe all that's needed. Perhaps you might want to, allow for callers to remain anonymous if they prefer, but something so simple can actually contain a breach very quickly and help address a problem pretty much in real time. Another simple example that I've come across that works very well is, a system of simple alert mechanisms. And this is where legal red, amber, green flags are shared and disseminated rapidly across the supply chain. And these alerts can go out, all across the supply chain, through to factory floors, through to third parties within the process, through to vendors and suppliers. And they need to be as simple and clear and ready to understand as possible. Of course, that can sit alongside, a training program for staff, but the alerts themselves might just be all that's needed to make sure that the issue is captured immediately and rapidly. A third example is to enhance the visibility around customer complaints. Sometimes it may just be customers themselves that identify a compliance breach. And making sure that you're picking up immediately customer complaints with compliance issues, and you're helping to contain the problem, might be, highly effective. In today's social media world, it might mean, ensuring that the right keywords get picked up as the complaints are coming in, and they get passed on to the compliance team immediately. Again, if it's a localized issue, then a local solution can be deployed very, very rapidly. I mean, these are just three very simple examples, but in my mind, they're highly effective, and they can sit alongside the more complicated technological solutions and operational solutions and solutions that involve training and complex monitoring and data gathering. But hopefully that helps by way of a few examples. Thanks, Dan.
No problem. Great. And thank you. Very good overview there. So we only have a few minutes left, and I want to be cognizant of both the audience and our panelists' time here. But when I open up to questions here, so we have one question that I thought was really solid that came in from an audience member, and I'm going to read it here. So bear with me here. I apologize. So as raw material supply chains continue to be constrained and pharmaceutical manufacturers are being forced to make trade-offs between producing for commercial requirements or supporting clinical pipeline production, what do you see as a long-term impact to patients? So we really haven't talked about that, right? In some ways, the ultimate end consumer. So what are the long-term impacts of patients from all of these challenges we've been mentioning here? And I'll open it up to all the panelists to see who would like to address that one, or we can all address it if we want to. Or I can call on someone.
Well, I'll give it a try, but I think it's very hard to predict, and it's very much dependent on type of products. But I think what we've seen again in the hard way in the delivery of the vaccines and how let's say the lack of availability impacts patients immediately for something that is in high demand. And so I do think that one of the consequences that we may see after this crisis is that people are gonna start thinking again on, how many production sites will we have, count on authorities to let products flow freely in a crisis mode, which what we've seen today, that not only vaccines were actually limited in the way they could cross borders or go from one region to the other, but also the raw materials to produce them, and that has led to shortage in some regions and so forth. So I do think that companies will think twice, certainly for the type of products that may be in sudden high demand, like vaccines, but there may be other products that may be subject to this type of disruptive change, and I do think that will have an impact on how and where they will be produced, and that companies will assure that they have sufficient production spread across the planet. I don't know if that's because it immediately impacts patients, certainly for those products that are in a high need. Don't know if that answered the question, but.
And I mean, I would agree with that, right? I was going to say that it would exacerbate the have and have-nots, right? Which is something that we saw with the COVID-19 pandemic, right? Where you prioritize where the demand is, where the higher margins are, and unfortunately that impacts those areas of the globe that may not be able to afford those prices. I think it would also possibly lead into, if there is a large enough outcry domestically, local regulatory action to try and right that, but that's a much more complicated story and not guaranteed either. But it could definitely have some kind of the regulatory or legislative impact on the back end. Tasneem or John, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I guess what I would add in terms of pricing, I think one long-term impact we would see, at least in the U.S., is more focus on pricing generally, because not only with respect to the pricing restrictions in place today that remain in place, that they presumably at some point over the course of the year will begin to fall away, but it moves very much hand in hand with antitrust enforcement, which is also a consumer protections and a consumer-facing regime and set of rules, and with the level of sort of activity we're seeing out of antitrust regulators out of Washington now, both at the Federal Trade Commission and the DOJ, I think we can expect to see a significant focus on pricing with respect to the pharmaceutical industry very specifically we have, and I think we'll continue to see that. So even if it's outside the scope of price gouging per se, we're going to see market forces again sort of tested by the regulatory landscape.
Great. So it's perfect timing too, as well. So we're coming up on our time. Actually, we're right on our time. So I want to thank our panelists. I want to thank the people behind the scenes who helped out set this up, and definitely thank our audience for attending today. So hopefully this has been useful to you all. Thank you, and I wish you all a good rest of your day or evening, wherever you may be located around the globe. Thank you.
Thank you. Gary.